I've been driving for Uber in Chicago for about 3 years now. Night shifts pay better, and I don't mind the quiet. Most drivers don't like dealing with drunk passengers or long, eerie rides through empty streets, but it never really bothered me. Until last week. It started like any other Friday night. The bars in Wicker Park were still buzzing, and I had just dropped off a couple at a club near North Milwaukee when I got pinged for a pickup near Humboldt Park. The name on the request was just unknown, which sometimes happens when someone's phone glitches or they use a third-party app. I didn't think much of it and accepted. The pickup location was near an old, half-abandoned strip mall. Most of the storefronts were boarded up, and the only light came from a flickering neon sign over a 24-hour laundromat. A single figure stood at the curb, motionless. No phone in hand, no sign they had even called a ride. Just standing there. I slowed down, flashing my brights to signal I had arrived. The figure, a man, tall, too thin, didn't move. His face was hidden under the hood of an oversized coat. I unlocked the door. "Hey, you call an Uber?" The man stepped forward, silent. Without a word, he slid into the back seat, the car dipping under his weight. The door clicked shut, and suddenly, the air inside felt heavier. I glanced at the app. No destination entered. Just a single, pulsing dot on the map with no address. "Where are you headed?" I asked, forcing casualness into my voice. Silence. I adjusted my mirror to get a better look at him, but his hood cast his face in complete shadow. "Sir? I need a drop-off location." A voice finally came. Low, rasping, like someone forcing words through a throat full of dust. "Drive." I hesitated. Normally, I don't start a trip without an address, safety reasons, company policy, but something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I checked my phone again. The dot on the map, it had moved. Without me touching anything. The app now showed a drop-off about 10 miles south. Near H.H. Holmes' murder castle. I let out a shaky breath. All right. The drive was quiet, except for the sound of the tires rolling over uneven asphalt. The city lights blurred past as we cut through the empty streets. I kept my eyes on the road, but the whole time, I could feel him back there, still as a statue, like he wasn't even breathing. Then, I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the radio, some interference from a passing station. But the volume was all the way down. The whispering continued, a dry, crackling sound. It was coming from the back seat. I gripped the wheel tighter. My mouth was dry. "You say something?" Silence. Then, "Turn left." I nearly jumped. His voice was different this time. Sharper. Commanding. I glanced at my GPS. There was no left turn here. Just an empty lot where an old building used to be. "Oh. I think the road's up ahead." A hand shot forward. Long fingers, too long, wrapped around the passenger seat. His nails were black. Split. Jagged like something that had been scratching at wood for a long, long time. "Turn left." I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was instinct. I cut the wheel and turned into the lot. Gravel crunched under my tires. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but a field of overgrown weeds and crumbling concrete. The whispering started again. Louder. Not one voice now. Many. I stopped the car. My breathing was shallow. "Sir, I think." I turned around. The back seat was empty. My stomach lurched. The door hadn't opened. I would have heard it. I turned back to the road. He was standing in front of the car. No transition. No movement. Just there, directly in the beams of my headlights. His head was down now, revealing a face that didn't make sense, skin stretched too tight over a skull that didn't match the shape of a human head. And his mouth was moving. Whispering. But the voices weren't coming from his lips. They were coming from behind me. In the car. I don't remember putting the car in reverse. I just remember the panic, the blind instinct, my foot slamming the pedal to the floor as the tires screamed against the pavement. For a split second, my headlights swept over the man's face, if I could even call it a face. His mouth was moving, whispering words I couldn't hear, but his eyes, there were no eyes. Just two gaping black pits where they should have been, dark voids that swallowed the light. My stomach lurched as I jerked the wheel, the car hitting the curb hard, bouncing violently before I straightened out and tore back onto the road. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles burned, and even though the lot was behind me, I refused to look in the mirror. Something told me that if I did, I would see him sitting in the back seat, right where he had been before. I kept driving, cutting through streets I barely recognized, my body rigid, my breath shallow. The city blurred past me, light smearing in my vision, but I didn't slow down. Only when I hit the I-55 ramp did I finally exhale, my mind scrambling for something, anything to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the night shift was finally getting to me, messing with my perception. That had to be it. A trick of the light, my mind playing games, nothing more. I repeated it like a mantra, forcing myself to believe it, forcing my pulse to slow. Then my phone chimed. A new ride request. My stomach twisted as I glanced at the screen, already knowing what I would see. The name on the request read unknown. My breath hitched. No. It had to be a coincidence. I gritted my teeth and stared at the notification, willing it to disappear. The request pulsed, waiting. I could have ignored it. I could have thrown my phone onto the passenger seat and driven home, shut off the app, and gone to sleep. But before I even realized what I was doing, my finger was already moving, already tapping accept. The moment I did, I felt it. A shift in the air, subtle at first, like the pressure in the car had changed, like the atmosphere itself had thickened. I didn't check the mirror. I didn't want to. My hands were ice cold, gripping the wheel, my breath suddenly shallow again. The destination had changed. No address, just a single pulsing dot on the map, dragging me further south, pulling me away from the city, away from anything familiar. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Maybe it was a glitch. That had to be it. Then the whisper came again. Drive. It wasn't coming from the phone. It wasn't coming from outside. It came from the back seat. My muscles locked, my heart hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to move, forced my foot onto the gas, forced my body to obey even though every part of my brain screamed at me to stop. The city lights grew dimmer as I sped down the empty highway, the buildings thinning out into vast stretches of industrial parks and abandoned lots, the world around me becoming darker, emptier, more silent than it had any right to be. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, telling myself not to, but doing it anyway. The back seat remained empty, but the feeling of presence never left. It was as though something was just outside my line of sight, pressing in around me, filling the spaces where air should have been. I could feel it sitting there, even though I couldn't see it. The whispering returned, faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the tires against asphalt, but growing louder, layered, voices overlapping, multiplying. I gritted my teeth, trying to drown it out, but it seeped into my head like water through cracked stone, spreading, invading, impossible to ignore. I blinked hard, focusing on the road, trying to hold onto something solid, something real. Then I saw the sign. It was old, rusted, barely legible in the dim glow of my headlights, standing crooked at the side of the road like it had been forgotten decades ago. There were no words, just an arrow pointing right. My GPS chirped, recalculating, adjusting the route without my input. I tightened my grip on the wheel, shaking my head. No. I wasn't turning. There was nothing down that road, just an empty lot, weeds breaking through the cracks in the pavement, a place where no one should be. Then the voice spoke again. Turn here. The whisper had changed. No longer distant, no longer layered. It was clear, direct. Close. Too close. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something else, something worse. My hands turned the wheel before my brain could tell them not to, and I veered off the main road onto the cracked pavement, my tires crunching over gravel and weeds. The moment I did, the world around me seemed to stretch, distort, like I had crossed into something else entirely. The whispering stopped. The car fell silent, save for the hum of the engine. But the silence wasn't right. It was too deep, too absolute, like sound itself had been stripped from the air. I swallowed hard, my throat aching. The road ahead was wrong. The buildings, what was left of them, stood like skeletons, their windows black and gaping, their facades crumbling, but they weren't covered in graffiti, weren't vandalized like abandoned places usually were. There were no signs of life here. No trash, no broken glass, no remnants of squatters or drifters. Just emptiness. I slowed down, my hands trembling on the wheel. The GPS still showed nothing. No street names, no points of interest. Just the dot. Just the destination. Just me and whatever was waiting at the end of this road. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was my reflection in the driver's side window. But as I glanced over, my heart turned to stone. The reflection wasn't mine. It was his. The man from the lot. Sitting in the back seat. Watching me. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. My fingers locked around the wheel, my foot frozen against the gas pedal. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head, forcing my eyes to the mirror. The back seat was empty. But the reflection remained. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as I reached for my phone, my fingers numb. I tapped the screen, trying to exit the app, trying to reset the GPS, trying to do anything. The screen flickered, then went black. And then, the whisper returned. "You're almost there." I didn't want to know what waited at the end of the road. But I was still driving straight toward it. The road stretched endlessly before me, cracked pavement vanishing into the dark, flanked by skeletal remains of buildings that seemed frozen in decay. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop gripping the wheel. My breath felt too loud in the suffocating silence. The car's headlights cast long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch and move in ways they shouldn't. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my ears, but beneath it, beneath the dull roar of blood and fear, I could hear it. The whispering had returned. Soft, layered, thick like oil slipping into the cracks of my mind. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look in the mirror, refusing to acknowledge the shifting shadows in the corners of my vision. The GPS was dead, the screen black and lifeless, but the pulsing dot in my mind remained, dragging me forward. The air inside the car was heavy, thick with something unseen, something that pressed against my skin, wrapped around my chest. I didn't remember rolling the windows down, but the night air seeped in, cold and damp, carrying a scent I couldn't place, something metallic, something old. My fingers ached, stiff with tension, and I realized I had been clenching the wheel so hard my knuckles had gone numb. The road narrowed, the buildings closing on either side, their facades cracked like rotting teeth, and as I drove deeper, I noticed something strange. There were no streetlights. No signs. No wires. The further I went, the less this place resembled the city I knew. It was as if I had passed through an invisible threshold, somewhere that had been forgotten, a place that shouldn't exist. My chest tightened with something worse than fear. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to slam the brakes, throw the car into reverse, speed back toward the distant glow of civilization, but I didn't. I couldn't. The road was leading me. Pulling me. I wasn't in control anymore. The air inside the car shifted again, and for the first time, I became aware of something else, breathing. It was faint, barely audible beneath the whispering, but it was there. Slow, measured, too steady to be mine. The realization clawed through my gut, sent ice through my veins, but I refused to look. I kept my hands on the wheel, my eyes locked ahead, my muscles rigid with unnatural stillness. The reflection had been in the window before. That wasn't my face. That wasn't my body. That wasn't me sitting in the car, and yet, I felt it watching, waiting. A shape appeared in the distance. A building, larger than the others, standing at the end of the road. My stomach dropped as recognition slid through me like a rusted blade. I had seen it before, in photos, in old articles, in history books about the darkest corners of Chicago. But this wasn't possible. It was demolished decades ago. It didn't exist anymore. But here it was, standing in the dead street, waiting for me. The murder castle. I swallowed hard, my fingers twitching against the wheel, my body screaming at me to turn back, but the car didn't slow. My foot was still on the gas, but it wasn't me pressing it. The building loomed closer, its brickwork blackened with age, its windows gaping and dark. The architecture was twisted, wrong, the floors uneven, the walls too steep, the angles unnatural, and yet I could see the remnants of what it had been. The infamous labyrinth designed by a killer. A place of corridors that led to nowhere, of doors that opened to brick walls, of rooms that were soundproofed, airtight, waiting for victims that would never escape. I was too close now. Too close to stop. My pulse pounded so hard my vision blurred, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the car inching toward the curb, slowing just enough for me to understand that I was expected to get out. I gritted my teeth, my muscles locked, my hands refusing to leave the wheel. I would sit here. I would stay inside. I would not open the door. I would not step outside. A knock. My body snapped tight as a sharp tap 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 echoed against the driver's side window. I did not turn. I did not blink. I did not move. The air inside the car changed, thickening, pressing against my chest, wrapping around my throat. The knock came again, harder this time, insistent, demanding. My hands were slick with sweat, my fingers aching from gripping the wheel, my heartbeat rattling against my ribs like a caged thing trying to break free. The knock did not come a third time. Instead, the handle of the door creaked. Something was trying to open it. A choked sound clawed its way up my throat, but I swallowed it down, my body rigid, my breath shallow. The handle rattled again, harder now, the sound filling the silence, filling the space where air should have been. The lock was still engaged, but I knew, somehow, that wouldn't matter. The handle stopped moving. The whispering grew louder. I didn't remember reaching for the door. I didn't remember unlocking it. But I heard the click. The door swung open. The night air rushed in, colder than before, sharp against my damp skin. My vision swam, my pulse slamming against my temples as I stared at the open space beside me. The street beyond was empty. The murder castle loomed, its doorway gaping, waiting. The air shifted again, something unseen moving inside the car. I turned my head. I shouldn't have. He was sitting in the passenger seat. Not the man from before. Something else. His skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones, his mouth split into a grin that was too wide, too wrong. His eyes, he had them. But they were the color of dead things, clouded, milky, empty. His fingers were long, too long, resting on his knees, perfectly still. The whispering was no longer coming from outside. It was coming from him. His head tilted, slow, mechanical, the grin never fading, his gaze locked onto mine. The silence stretched between us, heavy, unbearable. My breath hitched, my muscles frozen, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but I didn't move. I couldn't. He spoke. Not in a whisper. Not in the layered voices. His lips parted, and from his too wide mouth came words that were clear, sharp, deliberate. "You're late." I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. His grin widened. "Go inside." My body trembled, my vision blurred at the edges, my hands still gripping the wheel even though I knew, somehow, that I wasn't going to be able to stay here. The open doorway yawned before me, the impossible building waiting, its presence pressing against me like a living thing, urging me forward. My foot twitched against the pedal, my muscles ready to move, ready to run, but the thing in the passenger seat merely watched. His head tilted again, his fingers flexing once, his grin never fading. "Go inside," he repeated. And I knew, with a sick, sinking certainty, I was going to. I couldn't move at first. My hands still gripped the wheel, stiff and bloodless, my mind struggling to process what was happening. The open door beside me felt unnatural, like it didn't belong to the car but to something else, a threshold leading into something far worse than the cold Chicago streets I had come from. The thing in the passenger seat hadn't moved. His grin stretched too wide, his fingers unnaturally long, resting on his knees like a man posing for a photograph, waiting for the shutter to click. The air inside the car had changed again, thick and weighted, pressing against my chest with an unseen force that felt neither warm nor cold, just wrong. He didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't shift in the seat, but I could feel him watching, waiting, expectant. "You're late," he had said, his voice sharp and deliberate, as if he was the one who had been waiting for me all along. He said nothing else, but he didn't need to. There was only one thing left to do. I had to go inside. I knew it the way you know when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and the wind is nudging you forward, the way you know the ocean could swallow you if you wade too far. The knowledge wasn't spoken, wasn't given to me, it was simply there, a part of the air, a part of the night, a part of whatever had brought me here. My fingers twitched as I forced them to unclench from the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My body felt sluggish, distant, as though my limbs belonged to someone else, as though I had already left the car and I just hadn't realized it yet. The whispering had stopped outside, but that didn't bring relief. The absence of it was worse, like whatever had been speaking had finished saying what it needed to say, and now it was only waiting for me to take the next step. I turned my head toward the open door, and there it was, the building that shouldn't be here, the thing that had been destroyed decades ago but had somehow returned, standing before me like a memory dragged back into existence. The Murder Castle. H.H. Holmes' infamous maze of corridors, dead-end hallways, soundproof rooms, and hidden chutes that had led his victims to places where no one could hear them scream. I had seen pictures of it in books, but this was different. The real thing was more alive than I had ever imagined. The bricks looked wrong, too smooth in some places, too jagged in others, as if they had been rebuilt from fragments of the past and something else entirely. The windows were black, hollow, stretching up in uneven rows. The entrance loomed ahead, warped and uneven, the doorway too tall, too wide, too hungry. My body moved before my mind could stop it. My foot pressed against the pavement, and as soon as it touched the ground, the air around me shifted. The city disappeared. The distant hum of cars, the occasional siren, the faint murmur of life, all of it vanished in an instant, leaving behind only silence. It wasn't the normal quiet of an empty street, it was deeper, more absolute, as if the world outside had been swallowed whole. My breath hitched, my chest tightening with something colder than fear. I turned back toward the car, desperate to ground myself in something real, something normal, but the passenger seat was empty. The thing that had been there was gone. The door was still open, the engine still running, the dashboard screen still dark, but the presence that had filled the car just moments ago had vanished like smoke in the wind. I wanted to believe that meant I was alone, but I wasn't. I could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me, the air thick with the sense that I was being watched. The building was waiting. The open doorway was waiting. I could stand here forever, but it wouldn't matter. There was no way back. There was no street behind me anymore, no escape route, no home, no city. There was only this. I forced myself to move forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, the gravel crunching too loud beneath my shoes. The closer I got, the more the building seemed to warp, the angles shifting, the windows stretching, the very structure breathing in a way I didn't understand. The wood of the doorway was splintered and dark, the frame cracked like something had tried to claw its way in or out. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of damp wood, old dust, something faintly metallic beneath it all. The hallway ahead stretched too far, longer than it should have been, the ceiling too low, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips like skin sliding away from bone. A single light bulb swung above me, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move even when the light was still. The weight in my chest grew heavier with each breath. The space around me felt wrong. I turned to look back. The doorway was gone. My stomach clenched, nausea rolling through me as I spun in a slow, desperate circle. There was no exit. The world outside had been erased, replaced by more hallway, stretching infinitely in both directions. My hands trembled at my sides, my breath shallow, my mind scrambling for something, anything that made sense. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Distant at first, soft, deliberate, the sound of someone, or something, moving further down the hall. My pulse slammed against my ribs, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the walls narrowing slightly as if the space itself was closing in, guiding me forward. A door stood at the end of the corridor, slightly ajar, its edges warped, the room beyond hidden in shadow. The whispering had returned, but this time it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from the other side of the door. I moved toward it, my body heavy, my limbs numb, the air pressing against me like unseen hands. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices spilling through the gap, words slipping between sounds I couldn't understand. I didn't want to open the door. Every part of me rebelled against it, but the hallway behind me was closing, the walls narrowing, leaving me no choice. The knob turned beneath my hand. The room was empty. A single chair sat in the center, beneath the dim, flickering light. And in the chair, I felt my stomach lurch, my vision blurring, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was me. Sitting there, staring back, mouth open, whispering. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat, but the figure in the chair didn't move. It sat, perfectly still, hands resting on its knees, head tilted slightly, watching. My own face, my own eyes, my own body, but the mouth wouldn't stop moving, the words pouring out too fast, too layered, too many voices slipping over each other. My vision swam, the walls pressing inward, the light flickering in time with the whispering, the sound of my own voice filling the space in a way that was too loud, too wrong. Then it stopped. The figure in the chair smiled. And in my own voice, it spoke. "You're late." The walls closed in. The light flickered once. And then, everything went black. Darkness swallowed everything. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still standing or if I had been pulled into some void beyond even the twisted reality of that place. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, the sound of it magnified in the suffocating silence. I tried to move, but there was nothing beneath my feet, no sensation of weight, no air, no walls, just a dense, pressing blackness that felt like it had depth, like I was floating inside something that watched. Then, suddenly, the light flickered back, weak and sickly, and I was still standing in the room, still staring at myself in that chair. My other self, the thing wearing my face, hadn't moved. The whispering had stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse, thick and unnatural, buzzing in my ears like pressure before a storm. The figure's head tilted slightly, the same two-eyed grin still stretching my reflection's lips, but the eyes, my eyes, weren't mine. They were empty, too dark, too deep, as if whatever sat in that chair wasn't looking at me, but through me, past me, into something that I couldn't see. I didn't want to be here. My pulse pounded, my skin damp with cold sweat, my body screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was gone. The walls stretched in directions that didn't exist, twisting at impossible angles, the room bending inward like a throat swallowing its prey. I opened my mouth, trying to force words through the suffocating weight pressing against me, but no sound came. My throat burned, my body locked in place, every instinct telling me that if I moved, if I breathed wrong, this thing would know. It already did. My reflection blinked. It was the only movement in the room, small and insignificant, but it shattered whatever spell had held me frozen. The air shifted, sharp and electric, and suddenly I wasn't alone. Something brushed past me, unseen fingers trailing over my shoulder, the cold press of skin that wasn't real but felt solid. My breath hitched, my body tensed, but I still couldn't move. The presence grew stronger, the air thick with them, unseen things pressing in, breathing just behind my ear, whispering just beneath my skin, voices I couldn't understand forming words that weren't meant for human ears. The thing in the chair spoke. "You never should have stopped." My stomach turned, nausea curling up my throat, but the words weren't mine. The voice was my own, but it wasn't me speaking. The grin never faded, but the head tilted further, unnatural, bending at an angle that should have broken the neck. My fingers twitched. My muscles ached. The presence around me grew heavier, shifting, closing the space between us. I had to get out. I had to move. The air ripped. That's the only way I can describe it. One moment, I was frozen in place, suffocating under the weight of something I couldn't see, and then the world tore open. A sound like metal screeching against bone, a sensation like falling through myself. I slammed against the floor, real, solid floor, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. I was in a hallway. I gasped, my vision swimming, my fingers clawing at the wood beneath me as my body struggled to register where I was. The chair was gone. The thing wearing my face was gone. The twisted room had vanished, replaced by another impossible corridor stretching too far in both directions. The air was damp, the walls warped, the light fixtures overhead flickering in some rhythmic pattern as if something was tapping them from the inside. The building was shifting. Breathing. I could feel it. And then, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Not distant anymore. Coming toward me. I pushed myself up, my limbs weak, my lungs burning. The walls around me groaned as if the building itself was leaning in, listening. The footsteps didn't stop. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I ran. The hallway stretched endlessly, doors lining the walls, all identical, all shut. The air was thick with dust, the scent of something stale and rotting filling my lungs as I forced myself forward. The footsteps behind me quickened. Not running, but following. They didn't belong to one person. There were too many. Some lighter, some heavier, all moving in time with mine, as if the sound of my own escape was being played back at me, just a second behind, just close enough to let me know I wasn't alone. I didn't look back. The corridor twisted sharply, the floor beneath me groaning under the weight of my steps. The walls flickered, the edges of the space warping, bending inward, pulsing like a living thing. My breath came in sharp gasps, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I didn't know where I was running to. There was no end. No exit. No logic. Just the endless stretch of corridor, the doors that didn't open, the flickering lights overhead, and the things that were coming for me. Then, one of the doors opened. The noise was deafening, a sharp, echoing crack like something splitting open. A gust of freezing air rushed out, slamming against me, carrying the scent of decay, of damp wood and rotting fabric. The light beyond was flickering, dim, revealing nothing but shifting shadows inside. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The footsteps were almost on me now, the whispering voices laughing, mocking, calling my name. I had no choice. I ran through the door. The second I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. Silence. The air in the room was different. It wasn't thick with whispers, wasn't pulsing with unseen movement. It was still. Too still. My breath hitched as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The space wasn't large. A single desk sat against the far end of the room, an old, yellowed lamp casting a pale glow over stacks of papers and a ledger. The chair behind the desk was occupied. A man sat there. Or what was left of him. His skin was withered, stretched too tight over bones that barely held together. His suit was old, moth-eaten, the fabric discolored, the edges curling like burnt paper. His hands, thin and wrong, rested on the open book before him, fingers frozen mid-turn of a page that was older than it should have been. His head tilted slightly, his jaw slack, as if he had been waiting a very, very long time. Then, slowly, painfully, his head turned toward me. His lips cracked open, and in a voice far too alive for something that should have been dead, he rasped. "Welcome. Sign your name." I looked at the ledger. My stomach twisted. There was only one name written there. Mine. The room felt too small, too tight, like the walls were leaning inward, waiting for me to make a move. The man, or what had once been a man, remained perfectly still, his withered hands resting on the open ledger, his hollow gaze locked onto mine. The air inside was thick with dust, with the scent of old paper and something deeper, something rotting. The flickering lamplight cast shadows that didn't match his movements, stretching and twisting in ways that made my skin crawl. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, my body screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to run, but there was no door anymore. I had stepped inside and the entrance had vanished, swallowed by the same impossible void that had consumed every other exit in this place. There was only forward. "Sign your name," the man rasped again, his voice scraping against the silence like something too dry, too ancient, the sound of paper tearing inside an empty room. My stomach twisted as I forced myself to glance down at the ledger. The pages were yellowed with age, edges curled and brittle, filled with writing that blurred and shifted when I tried to focus on it. But my name was already there. The ink was fresh, the letters stark against the page, written in handwriting that wasn't mine but was too close. My pulse slammed against my ribs, my hands trembling at my sides. I didn't remember writing it. I didn't remember touching the pen. But it was there. A name signed in acceptance. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my skin damp with sweat. I didn't sign anything. My voice came out hoarse, too small in the suffocating air. The man's jaw shifted slightly, his lips peeling apart into something that might have once been a smile but now only looked wrong. His fingers twitched against the paper, brittle joints cracking in the silence. "You arrived," he murmured, tilting his head just slightly. "That is enough." My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. The weight of the words settled over me like a closing trap, the realization sinking in too fast, too heavy. This wasn't a choice. This wasn't an invitation. It had never been. I had been pulled here, drawn into this place long before tonight, long before I ever accepted that first ride request. There had never been a destination on the map, not because it was unknown, but because it had already been decided. The whispering returned. Not inside the room, but outside, pressing against the walls like voices just beyond a closed door. Except there was no door, no visible way in or out, only the steady hum of something that had been waiting, watching, gathering. My breath hitched as the walls themselves seemed to shift, bulging inward like lungs drawing in air, the entire space breathing around me. The flickering light dimmed for a second, just enough for the shadows to lengthen, just enough for me to see them. Figures. Not solid. Not human. Just outlines, barely visible against the walls, standing motionless, waiting. I took a step back, my pulse hammering so loudly I could barely hear my own breath. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin, slowing my movements as if I were wading through something unseen. The man at the desk didn't move, but his head tilted just slightly, just enough for me to see the way his lips stretched wider, the way his grin split into something jagged, something that no longer resembled a human face. "You belong to the house now." The words sent a sharp bolt of nausea curling through my stomach. My fingers twitched at my sides, my body desperate for something, anything, to ground me, but the only thing in reach was the desk, the ledger, my name written where it shouldn't be. I could feel the thing's gaze, hollow and unblinking, drilling into me, waiting for me to accept what had already been decided. The whispers outside grew louder, not chaotic, not frantic, but patient, shifting in a rhythm that felt too deliberate. A heartbeat. The building itself had a heartbeat. I stumbled back another step, my legs weak beneath me. The figures in the walls didn't move, but they didn't need to. Their presence was enough, their outlines pressed into the space where doors should have been, the unseen weight of their presence filling the air, waiting for something I didn't understand. My stomach twisted as the man at the desk finally moved, his withered fingers dragging against the pages of the ledger, flipping them slowly, deliberately, showing me what was written beneath my name. More names. Hundreds. Thousands. Some scratched out. Some untouched. Some smeared as if the ink had never fully dried. Some half-written, incomplete. Some names I recognized. My vision swam. My breath caught in my throat. The weight of it pressed into my chest, something cold curling in my ribs, spreading outward, wrapping around my lungs like unseen fingers. the thing wearing the shape of a man, sighed, a sound that should have been breath but was only emptiness. "You are the driver," he said, his voice quieter now, softer, like someone explaining a rule to a child. "You pick them up. You bring them back. That is how it works." I shook my head, my skin damp, my thoughts unraveling too fast to hold onto them. My breath came in uneven gasps, the floor beneath me feeling too distant, too unreal, the room pressing inward like a mouth closing around me. "No," I whispered, but it wasn't a denial. It wasn't an argument. It was just fear. The man turned the ledger back to the beginning, flipping pages so smoothly they didn't seem real. The first name, written in ink so old the paper had warped around it, stood alone, its edges burned into the page as if it had been the foundation for everything else. My vision blurred, the letters twisting and shifting, refusing to focus, until they did. Until they settled into something impossible. H. Holmes. The nausea hit me like a fist, my legs threatening to give out beneath me, my fingers digging into the edge of the desk as I fought to keep myself standing. The heartbeat in the walls throbbed louder now, the whispering outside rising and falling in time with it, the rhythm unmistakable, hungry. The man smiled wider, his teeth jagged, splintered. "You are the driver," he repeated. "The car is yours. The road is yours. The passengers are waiting." The shadows in the walls moved. Not closer. Not away. Just waiting. The whispering grew louder, curling into words I couldn't understand but somehow knew, slipping into my thoughts like they had always been there. I wasn't supposed to arrive. I was supposed to bring them back. I looked down at my hands. They were already on the wheel. The car was already moving. The streetlights outside blurred, the city stretching out before me, pulsing, shifting, the roads twisting in directions that shouldn't exist. The GPS blinked to life, but there was no address, no street name, just a pulsing, just another pickup, just another passenger waiting. The name on the screen flickered. Unknown. I wanted to slam the brakes, to scream, to wake up from whatever this was. But I couldn't. My foot pressed the gas. My hands gripped the wheel. Because I wasn't driving anymore. I was just delivering. The city stretched before me, familiar yet wrong, the streets and buildings arranged in ways I almost recognized, but with something subtly warped, slightly misaligned, as if someone had rebuilt Chicago from memory but left pieces missing. The skyline pulsed in the distance, shifting each time I blinked, as though the buildings themselves were moving when I wasn't looking. My hands gripped the wheel, but I knew I wasn't in control. The car moved on its own, following roads that hadn't existed a moment before, drawn forward by something unseen. The GPS screen glowed softly, displaying a pulsing, another pickup request from unknown. My breath came slow and uneven as I stared at the notification, the sense of inevitability curling deep inside me. I hadn't accepted the request. I hadn't needed to. The car had already done it for me. The streets around me were quiet, too quiet. The usual noise of the night, distant sirens, the occasional honk of a car, the murmured conversations of pedestrians, was absent. The sidewalks were empty, lined only with shadows stretching unnaturally long beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. The air inside the car had thickened again, pressing against my skin, filling the space beside me with something unseen. I didn't look. I knew better now. The sensation was enough. The car slowed as it neared the pickup location, easing toward the curb outside a stretch of abandoned buildings. The storefronts were dark, their windows hollow, their names erased as if they had never been there. I recognized the street, but only in the way you recognize a face from a dream, familiar, but impossible to place. The GPS chimed softly, displaying the words waiting for rider. There was no one there. I gripped the wheel, my fingers tightening as I told myself not to react, not to turn, not to look, but the air in the car shifted. Not from movement. Not from breath. Just shifted. A tap, deliberate and soft, echoed from the back seat. My body locked, my pulse hammering in my throat. It hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside. The moment stretched, thick with waiting, with something unseen pressing against the space just behind me. I stared at the windshield, at the distorted reflections of the streetlights flickering against the glass, and told myself to stay still. My vision blurred at the edges, my ears straining against the silence, but the moment I heard the second tap, closer this time, I knew I had already failed. My eyes flicked to the mirror. The back seat was full. Not with people. Not with shapes. Just shadows. Layers of them, twisting, overlapping, watching. Their outlines shifted, bleeding into one another, moving in slow, unnatural waves, as though the darkness itself had gathered into something that barely held form. They did not speak, but I could feel them thinking. The whispering began again, not from mouths, not from voices, but from the air itself, filling the space between my skin and theirs. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing against me, creeping into my bones, settling behind my ribs like something growing inside me. The lock on the back door clicked open. I hadn't touched it. The door creaked as it swung outward, revealing the empty sidewalk, the waiting night stretching beyond the reach of the streetlights. A presence shifted beside me. Not in the seat. Not in the mirror. Just beside me. My body refused to move, my fingers white against the wheel, my breath caught in my throat, but I could feel them leaving. The weight in the car lifted, the presence dissolving into the dark, slipping into the spaces between buildings, vanishing into places where no one should exist. The back door clicked shut on its own. The whispering faded. The car sat silent once more. The GPS chimed. Drop off complete. New pickup available. I exhaled shakily, my hands trembling against the wheel, my skin damp with cold sweat. The screen pulsed again, waiting. Another pickup. Another dot. Another passenger. My stomach twisted, the weight of inevitability settling deeper into me, colder than fear, heavier than resignation. This was what I was now. The realization curled around my spine, wrapping its tendrils through my thoughts, suffocating the last remnants of denial. There was no fighting it. No escaping it. I was the driver. The car was mine, but the road wasn't. The destinations weren't. The passengers weren't. But they were waiting. And they would always be waiting. My fingers hovered over the screen, my breath still uneven. I could ignore it. I could leave the car, run into the empty streets, disappear into the shifting city before it swallowed me whole. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The car had already decided. The next request had already been accepted. The engine hummed beneath my hands, the headlights cutting through the dark as the car pulled forward on its own, easing back onto the empty road, following the path laid out before me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't need to know. The road knew. And it was never going to let me go. The road stretched endlessly before me, disappearing into the horizon where the city should have been, but the skyline was gone, swallowed by something vast and shifting, something that pulsed just beneath the surface of reality. The buildings blurred past in slow, distorted smears of color, their shapes twisting and bending at the edges of my vision, as if they weren't real at all but merely imitations of a world I once knew. The engine thrummed beneath my fingers, the vibration familiar, grounding, but I wasn't driving. The car moved without my input, following an invisible path, carrying me toward another pickup, another passenger. The GPS screen pulsed steadily, displaying a name that flickered in and out of focus, a request that had already been accepted before I could make the choice. There had never been a choice. The streets narrowed, folding in on themselves, twisting into unfamiliar corridors where the streetlights flickered in a rhythmic pattern as if signaling to something unseen. The city had rearranged itself around me, the familiar paths erased, replaced by roads that hadn't existed before tonight, roads that would lead me exactly where they wanted me to go. I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest, the quiet knowledge that I was only a piece in something much larger, something that had been playing out long before I ever stepped into this car. The road knew where I was going. It had always known. The car slowed on its own as I approached the next destination, easing toward the curb outside a narrow alley where the buildings leaned together like conspirators sharing a whispered secret. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow passageway, but there was no one there. The air in the car shifted, the atmosphere thickening, stretching the silence into something unbearable. The GPS chimed once, waiting for Ryder. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The shadows in the alley pulled unnaturally, darker than the night around them, moving in slow, pulsing waves, folding inward like something unseen was drawing breath. The silence deepened, pressing into my ears, into my skull, until it was no longer absence but presence, a heavy, deliberate waiting. The lock on the back door clicked open again. I swallowed, my throat dry, my fingers locked around the wheel as the whispering began, not inside the car this time, but from the alley itself, drifting forward like a tide pulling toward shore, layered voices stacking over each other, overlapping in words I couldn't understand but somehow recognized. They were speaking to me, calling me. The air turned cold against my skin. Something stepped forward. It didn't walk. It didn't emerge. It just was. One moment, the alley was empty. The next, it was there. Not a person. Not a shape. Just a figure. A smear against reality, something that had been taken from the world and twisted into the suggestion of a man, an outline barely holding together, something that did not belong to this side of existence but had been pulled through. Its presence was suffocating, pressing against the inside of the car, slipping into the air, filling the space around me before it had even entered. But it did enter. It always did. The back door swung open. The whispering swelled. The temperature dropped, and I could feel it settle in. I didn't turn around. I didn't look. But I knew. It was in the back seat. It had always been in the back seat. The door closed softly, sealing the space again, locking us inside together. The air inside the car tightened, the pressure wrapping around my ribs, around my throat, my breath coming shallow and uneven as I stared at the road ahead, willing the GPS to update, to give me something real, something normal, but it remained static, frozen, the route unchanged. Then, it spoke. Not in a whisper. Not in the layered voices of the others. But in my voice. You know where to go. I didn't answer. My hands trembled against the wheel, my stomach twisting, my skin damp with cold sweat, but the car was already moving, pulling forward on its own, merging back onto the road, slipping into the empty streets as if it had done this 1,000 times before. Maybe it had. Maybe I had. The city blurred past, but it wasn't the city anymore, not the one I knew. The road stretched too far, looping back in ways that made no sense, folding in on themselves like something alive, leading me deeper, guiding me toward a destination I didn't want to reach. The thing in the backseat didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't shift, but I could feel its presence pressing against the edges of my mind, curling into the spaces between my thoughts. The whispering outside had stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. It meant that whatever was inside the car with me no longer needed to call. It had already arrived. The GPS flickered, the screen flashing for a moment before updating. Arriving at final destination. My pulse thundered. My hands clenched the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I couldn't stop driving. The car pulled forward, the headlights illuminating something ahead, something that shouldn't be there. I knew this place. I had never been here before, but I knew it. It stood at the end of the road, waiting, the architecture familiar and impossible, the angles wrong, the shadows stretching in ways that defied logic. It had been destroyed decades ago, erased from existence, but it had never truly left. It had only been waiting. The murder castle. I choked on a breath, my vision blurring as the car rolled to a slow stop at the curb, the street deserted, the air too still. The car unlocked itself. The backseat door swung open, but I didn't look. I didn't move. The presence behind me shifted, a slow unraveling of something that had never truly had form, something that had won the idea of shape without ever needing to exist fully. And then, it left. The pressure in the car lifted, the weight dissolving, the presence slipping away into the waiting night, vanishing into the house that should not exist. The door swung closed. Silence. I sat there, my breath shaking in my chest, my hands locked around the wheel, my mind still catching up to the fact that I was alone. The GPS screen blinked, then displayed a new message. Drop-off complete. Awaiting next ride. My fingers twitched. My breath steadied. The engine on beneath me. I reached for the screen. My hand hovered over the go offline button. I could end it now. I could stop. I could step out of the car, walk away, leave the road behind, never take another ride again. But even as the thought formed, I knew it wasn't real. The road wouldn't let me go. The next request was already waiting. The city stretched before me, the skyline pulsing, shifting, rearranging itself again, the roads unfolding into new directions, new places, new passengers waiting. I lowered my hand. The car pulled forward. The road stretched ahead, infinite. I drove into the night. I would always drive.